yesterday's Shir of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explained the difference between Klippas Neiga and the totally dark Klippa, in that Klippas Neiga, even when it falls into the level of totally dark Klippa, because the person used a permissible food or a permissible relationship, he used it only for human and animal pleasure, that drags the Klippas Neiga down to the level of totally dark Klippa. Or if he committed a sin with using the food or a relationship, because he ate what is not permitted, and he had a relationship that was not permitted, that is totally dark Klippa. So the totally dark Klippa remains forever bound to unholiness, whereas the Klippas Neiga, even though it descended into the level of the totally dark Klippa, yet as soon as the person does chuva and goes back to serving God, the food or the relationship or the energy that was put into it is redeemed and raised and brought back to godliness along with the person. And that's why it's called mutar, untied, because it can be separated from the Klippa. Whereas the totally dark Klippa, it is called asur, which means bound or tied, so that even when a person does tshuva, the item of the sin, the object of the sin, does not rise and is not separated from the unholiness, but remains tied to unholiness until Mashiach comes. The other possibility is that the person does such a tshuva, an unusual tshuva, that turns the sin into a mitzvah. And in that way, not only does the person return to godliness through his tshuva, but the act or the object with which he sinned also returns to godliness. It becomes a mitzvah. We are about 6 lines from the bottom at the period. The line begins with the word lo netzach. However, there's another condition in unholiness different from the prohibited relationship, and that is the energy in the seed that is wasted. Although it too has become part of the totally evil Klippa, totally dark Klippa, although originally it was Klippas Neiga, it was neutral. But because of the sin of wasting the seed, it becomes part of the totally dark Klippa. Yet, unlike the prohibited relationship, which cannot be redeemed until Mashiach comes, or through this special kind of tshuva, however, this sin, the sin of the wasting of seed, here, the energy that was dragged down into totally dark Klippa can be redeemed through a proper tshuva, not an intense tshuva, but a proper tshuva, and with deep intention, kavana, by the reading of the Shema before going to bed. Keneda meharizal, as is known from the Arizal, umerumas begemara, and also hinted at in the Gemara. So here we have 3 levels now. We have, number 1, a level of Klippas Neiga, a permissible thing, that was dragged down into unholiness, into totally dark Klippa, by being totally selfish and totally indulgent. So if a person is gluttonous, even with kosher food, or he is selfish in permissible relationships, that drags it down into the level of totally unholy Klippa, and that rises immediately as the person does tshuva. Then there is the prohibited food or the prohibited relationship, and that does not rise when the person does tshuva, unless the tshuva is of this higher level of tshuva out of love, with ahava rabbah, with a great love. Then there is the third condition, and that is the wasting of the seed, which on the one hand is a sin, not like a permissible act but selfish. This is a prohibited act, and yet, unlike the prohibited relationship, it doesn't take an unusual chuva to elevate and reclaim the energy that went into the sin, but a normal chuva with kavanah during the Shema, before going to bed, elevates and redeems that energy. The Gemara hints at it when the Gemara says that kol hakei kriya Shema al mitosei, that the reading of the Shema before going to bed is ki'ilu eiches cheref shel shtei piyes, is as if he is wielding a sword, of a double-edged sword, lahare gufes hachitzenim, to kill the unholy bodies shenasu levush, that have become the garments lechayu shebetipes, that have become the garments for the energy of the wasted seed. And then when the body that enclothes this energy is killed, then the energy rises and goes back to klipas noiga, as is known to those who study Kabbalah. This is why the sin of wasting the seed is not mentioned in Torah along with the other prohibited relationships. In the list of relationships that are prohibited, the Torah does not mention the wasting of seed. Although you would think that this sin should be included in that list, because not only is it of equal significance, not only is it equally sinful, but in fact its sinfulness is even worse in one sense than all the other prohibited relationships. Godel aveinei, the sin is greater bebechinas hagadlus, both in terms of the intensity of the unholiness, the ribui hatuma, and also in the quantity of unholiness. The haklipes, and the klipa that is generated, shemelid umarbe b'me'ed me'ed b'hitzo azer levatolo, the unholiness that is created and generated very much in the sin of wasting the seed. Yesem b'yes asures, more so than in the prohibited relationships. I'll soon explain. But what he's saying is that in the sin of wasting seed, there is a greater unholiness, a greater tumah, both in quantity and in quality. However, on the other hand, shebebi yesasures, in the prohibited relationships, meisiv kayach v'chayis b'klipot meya b'yeser, he gives energy and gives life, or adds life and strength to a much worse klipa, ad she'enei yochol lahalis misham hachayis b'tshuva. And because he gives the energy, he adds energy to a lower and worse klipa, unholiness, he is unable to redeem it, he's unable to retract it in his tshuva. So what we're saying is that on the one hand, the sin of the wasting of the seed is worse than the prohibited relationships, and therefore should be in that list. But on the other hand, it doesn't appear in that list in Torah among the prohibited relationships, because in the prohibited relationships, tshuva is much harder, whereas in the wasting of seed, tshuva comes more easily. Hagah. We'll learn the note, and then we'll explain. Mipnei, why is it that it's so hard to do tshuva for a prohibited relationship? Mipnei sheniklato b'yisei denukva deklipo, because this energy that was expressed in the sin of a prohibited relationship is absorbed into the feminine trait of klipa, hamikabeles v'keiletes achayis mehagdusha, which absorbs the energy from holiness. And therefore, once it's absorbed, it is much harder to redeem it, to reclaim it in doing chuva. Whereas in the wasting of the seed, there is no feminine aspect to the sin, to the klipa. It is only the kayach and the energies of the feminine trait of klipa that clothes the energy that is used in the sin of wasting seed, as is known to those who study Kabbalah. The idea of it being this: everything is made up of a body and a soul. Everything is made up of a light and a vessel. Every sin also contains a light and a vessel. Now we know that when a person is teaching, for example, the lesson that he teaches, as it comes from him, is the light. The student is the vessel. The mind of the student is the vessel. And when the lesson is absorbed by the student in his mind, you now have a light in a vessel. Now the light without the vessel is unrestrained, is unlimited, and undefined. In holiness, that would mean that the light is more infinite and greater and more edel and so on than when it comes into the vessel. The vessel restricts it, the vessel gives it a specific, definite form and shape, and in that process diminishes it to some degree. So a light in a vessel, in holiness, the vessel diminishes the light. It also contains the light. The same is true in unholiness, that the light without the vessel is freer and more expansive than when it comes into the vessel. Therefore, in the act of a sin, the Yetzer Hara, the Klippa, has two parts. There is the desire that a person has to expand his ego, to expand his existence, to make his existence greater and more endless by spreading it, by generating it outward, so that more and more people and more of the world know of him and are affected by him and so on. In that way he expands his ego, his existence. And then there's also the response to the temptation of Klippa, and that is to be received in an unholy fashion. Just as in holiness, there is the desire to share what one knows because one wants to give as an expression of self. He needs to give. And then there's also the desire to satisfy the receiver, the student. So a teacher teaches for two reasons. First of all, because he wants to express himself. Here we're talking about a holy motivation, to express himself and thereby intensify his own Kedusha. When you express the Kedusha, you deepen it. And on the other hand, there's also the desire or the concern for the student that the student should receive, should know, should be taught. The same is true also in unholiness, that when a person sins, there are two things here. One is that he wants to express himself, and the other is that he wants to satisfy the desire. So there's a masculine and a feminine part to everything, including also the sin. So when a person sins, the masculine part is the self-expression. He wants to express himself. The feminine part is that he wants to be received by someone, and the receiving is the feminine. So when he is sinning spontaneously, the part that wants to be expressed, that's the masculine part. When he sins in response to the desire, in response to the call, if he is reacting to something, that is the feminine, that is the part that receives the sin, the receptive part of the sin. this expresses itself in the physical in one of two ways of sinning. Either the person sins with another person, so there's a male and a female, or the person sins by himself where there's only male. So which is worse? On the one hand, as we said before, the masculine without the feminine is unrestrained, and therefore there is more tumah, there is more unholiness generated when the person sins without a partner than when he sins with a partner. Because he's not restrained by a vessel, he's not restrained by the recipient. On the other hand, the very fact that he's not restrained means that he is not contained and is independent, and it all depends on him. Whereas when there is another person involved, then the energy is no longer within his own control. It has been absorbed by the klippa. It's been absorbed by the unholiness, by the feminine trait of unholiness, and it's no longer up to him to reclaim it as he chooses. So that even when he decides to do chuva, the energy that he invested in the sin does not easily return with him. It remains stuck in klippa. And that's why it will take a special chuva, a special kind of chuva, in order to elevate that from the klippa. So, on the one hand, the sin of wasting seed is more sinful than the prohibited relationships, precisely because there is no partner. On the other hand, when it comes to the consideration of which is easier to reclaim, for the same reason that it is more sinful, because it has no restraints, it has no receiver, there is no feminine side to it. By that same token, when it comes to doing tshuva, the fact that there is no feminine side to it makes it easier to do tshuva because it's completely up to him. Back to the text. In the prohibited relationships, he has to do that kind of a tshuva. From such an intense love, until his intentional sins become mitzvahs, virtues, and with this we'll understand another thing, the statement from the sages, what is the mistake that cannot be corrected? One who has a prohibited relationship and gives birth to an illegitimate child. That can't be corrected. Why? Even if he does the higher level of tshuva, the tshuva out of love, out of intense love, and the sin becomes a mitzvah, yet he still can't elevate the energy of that sin to holiness, since it has already embodied itself in this world, and it is clothed in a body, flesh and blood, of the illegitimate child. So as long as the child is there, the energy that went into the sin cannot be elevated. And that's because it is no longer within his power to elevate. It has already been absorbed into a physical being, into the body of the child. However, as we said before, all of this deals with elevating the energy or cleaning up the blemish that was caused in the world. The person himself who does tshuva, whether it's tshuva for having indulged in the permissible, or whether it's tshuva for the violation of a prohibition, or tshuva for having brought an illegitimate child into the world, in all cases, when a person does tshuva, he is a complete Baal tshuva, and he is higher than the tzaddik, even though the blemishes that he caused in the world have not yet been cleaned or fixed. But the person separates himself from that uncleanliness, from that unholiness. He becomes what a Jew is by nature meant to be. He is once again in a place of holiness and in a state of holiness, and the damage that was caused by the sin, the damage to the world, will be fixed when Mashiach comes. or if he does a higher level tshuva. And even that which the Gemara says that it can't be fixed, la yuchal liskein, there is a tshuva that is even more intense than the tshuva that the Alter Rebbe described here, that helps even for the sin that brings into the world an illegitimate child. The Hayem Yem, for the 6th day of Teves, the Rebbe writes, Da elikei avicha v'avdehu b'leiv shalim. The pasuk says, know the God of your fathers and serve him with a whole heart. Every sort of Torah knowledge and understanding, even the most profound, is not an end in itself, but it must be expressed in Aveda, in serving God with the whole heart, which means that the intellectual attainment, having studied and understood, must bring about an actual refinement and improvement of one's character, and must be translated into a deep-rooted inner attachment to God, a feeling of closeness, all of which is what Hasidic language, Hasidic lexicon calls Aveda.